The Goblet of Fire is my favorite of the Harry Potter books. Unfortunately, I can't say the same for the movie. Now, it's worth noting that this is the point where the books get significantly longer, and as such, there is inevitably more that must be cut and changed to bring the movies down to a reasonable length. I understand that. However, in the case of this film, I think the things they chose to cut were severely to the detriment of the story. I don't know if I can point out many specific moments that were bad, though there are definitely a couple. The problems with this movie tend to be more broad, giving the plot a very different and, in my opinion, less suspenseful and engaging structure from the book. My biggest problem is how the movie does away with almost all of the mystery contained in the book, as it reveals things far earlier and even cuts entire mysteries altogether, though some justifiably, for the sake of cutting down on time. Also, a lot of the new characters introduced in this just weren't given the same level of characterization as their book counterparts. And even returning characters like Hagrid and Sirius were shortchanged in this regard. That's not to say the movie is bad, however. I still enjoy watching it. But as an adaptation, it is easily my least favorite of the series. Well, along with Half-Blood Prince. So, let's begin. First off, I do really appreciate that the movie included the opening scene with Frank Bryce where he is murdered by Voldemort. They could easily have left it out. Unfortunately, it doesn't include any of the history surrounding this house. To be fair though, I don't know how they really could have got it across in a visual medium. So, this house that Voldemort is in actually used to belong to his Muggle father and grandparents, the Riddle family, and Frank Bryce was their gardener. One day, about 50 years ago, the three Riddles were all found mysteriously dead, and everyone in the village suspected Frank to be the murderer, as he was the only other person with the key to the house. Being Muggles, they obviously didn't know about magic, so he was brought in by the police. However, after a further examination of the bodies, the police found no signs that they had been murdered at all, so they had to let Frank go. As we later learn, it was actually a teenage Tom Riddle who murdered his father and grandparents with the killing curse. After that, the house passed through several owners, but none of those families stayed long because of the unsettling feeling it gave. Soon enough, no one wanted to set foot in the house anymore, so it fell into disrepair. So in the present, Frank sees the flickering lights in the house and thinks some delinquent kids from the village broke in and started a fire. He heads up to deal with it and comes across Voldemort discussing his plans. Now, while I do praise the movie for including this scene at all, there is one big change here that really affects the entire movie. Barty Crouch Jr. is here. So, that's one big mystery that the movie just completely does away with. In the book, not only is Barty Crouch Jr. not present in this scene, we don't even know he exists until almost 3/4 of the way into the book. And even then, we think he died in Azkaban years ago. And we don't even know for sure whether he really did work for Voldemort when he was alive. It's only at the end, when he's revealed as Moody, that we learn that A, he does work for Voldemort, and B, he's not dead. In the movie, Voldemort tells Crouch Jr. to
gather our own comrades, send them aside.
This leads to Crouch Jr. casting the Dark Mark over the Quidditch World Cup. Another mystery just tossed aside, as in the book, the question of who cast the Dark Mark is ongoing until Crouch Jr. confesses it at the end. This also completely changes Crouch Jr.'s reason for casting the Dark Mark. In the book, it's not because Voldemort told him to. In fact, he hasn't even joined back up with Voldemort yet. It's because he's enraged to see Death Eaters engaging in self-indulgent violence rather than searching for their master. So he sent up the mark to scare them. So what happens in the book here? Well, first of all, it's just Voldemort and Wormtail talking, and Frank hears a lot more of their conversation. Most of it is very vague, a way of building up intrigue and hinting at, without flat-out revealing, Voldemort's plan to us. We learn that Voldemort has a plan that he wants to use Harry for. Wormtail suggests that it could be done with any other wizard much more easily, given how well protected Harry is, and volunteers to go find one. However, it's pretty obvious that he's already regretting returning to Voldemort, and this is merely an excuse to abandon him. Voldemort calls him out on it and refuses to allow him to do so. Voldemort also mentions a faithful servant who will soon have returned to him and help them with their plan. This, of course, is Barty Crouch Jr. They also talk about Bertha Jorkins, a witch from the Ministry who Wormtail managed to bring to Voldemort. We learn that Voldemort got information from her which he used to form his plan, and then he killed her. Bertha Jorkins' role in things is another ongoing mystery throughout the book, but it's one that I think was okay for the movie to cut. The information Voldemort got from her, as we learn at the end, is that the Triwizard Tournament will be taking place at Hogwarts this year, that Mad-Eye Moody will be teaching there, and that Barty Crouch Jr. is still alive, something she had found out by accident. I don't think it's really necessary in the movie to explain how Voldemort knew these things. And plus, they completely did away with the Barty Crouch Jr. mystery anyway, so the Burke and Jorkins stuff was pretty cuttable. So Frank is outside the door listening to all of this, not understanding a lot of it, but enough to know that these people are bad news. He decides to go call the police, but at that moment Nagini shows up and tells Voldemort he's there. I do like the way Nagini was done in the movies, and that they didn't give her some monstrous design like the Basilisk. Don't get me wrong, that design worked great for the Basilisk, but I'm glad they made Nagini just an extra large snake. Anyway, in the book, Voldemort doesn't kill Frank immediately like in the movie. He invites him in, and Frank, being a veteran of World War II, defiantly stands up to him and even tries to improvise some lies about why Voldemort shouldn't kill him, all of which Voldemort sees through, of course. Voldemort then has Wormtail turn his chair around to face Frank, which Wormtail does, seeming terrified. He's not grinning evilly like in the movie, and Voldemort kills Frank. Harry Potter then wakes up as he was seeing all of this in a dream/vision. By the way, an alternate title for this movie could be Harry Potter and the Year No One Got a Haircut. So at this point, the movie skips ahead a good 46 pages. We start off with Harry at the Weasleys and immediately see Mr. Weasley leading the kids to the Quidditch World Cup, though we, and they, don't know that's where they're going. It kind of feels to me like this movie wanted to get to Hogwarts as quickly as possible, but knew the events at the Quidditch World Cup were too important to skip. The Dursleys were completely cut from this movie, as was everything at the Weasleys' house before and after the Quidditch World Cup. In fact, if I'm being honest, the Dursleys really get the short end of the stick in all the movies from this point on, being completely cut from this and Half-Blood Prince, and having fairly significant moments and revelations removed from Order of the Phoenix and Deathly Hallows. I'll get to those when I get to them, though. As far as this movie goes, I can't really blame them for cutting the Dursleys, as they have a pretty insignificant role here compared to all the other books, aside from Half-Blood Prince. They get a letter from Mrs. Weasley, using the Muggle Postal Service, asking if Harry can come stay at their house so he can go to the Quidditch World Cup with them. Harry intimidates Vernon by invoking Sirius's name, who the Dursleys still think is a mass murderer, and he is allowed to go. Mr. Weasley, Ron, Fred, and George arrive through Floo Powder to bring Harry to their house. That's pretty much it, so cutting straight to the Weasleys' house makes sense for the movie. I will say, though, there are some pretty funny moments here in the book. First of all, the letter Mrs. Weasley sends. She has no idea how the Muggle Postal Service works, so she covered every inch of the letter in stamps. And of course, there are several hilarious moments when the Weasleys arrive and interact with the Dursleys. When they arrive, they initially get stuck in the chimney because the Dursleys have an electric fireplace, so Mr. Weasley has to blast it away, making a mess of the Dursleys' living room. We also see Mr. Weasley geeking out over the Muggle stuff in the house, and Dudley clamping his hands over his butt all throughout, remembering what happened the last time he encountered a wizard. And last but not least, Fred and George accidentally drop some sweets on the living room floor, which Dudley eats, causing his tongue to grow several feet. All of this would have been a lot of fun to see on screen, but considering the length of the book, I don't blame the filmmakers for cutting it. One thing I do think the movie should have shown more of, however, is Harry's reaction to the dream he had and the pain in his scar. This is the first time his scar has burned since year 1, and that was because Voldemort was near. So Harry is understandably worried about what it means that it's burning now, and he writes to Sirius about it. Speaking of Sirius, that's a character who really got the shaft in this movie. In the book, Harry has regular correspondence with him through letters. He appears to Harry in the Gryffindor common room fireplace, and even makes in-person appearances, once outside Hogsmeade to talk to the trio, and again at the end in Dumbledore's office. In the movie, we just get the fireplace scene, and even that is very simplified from what it is in the book. I really like Sirius as a character, and Gary Oldman plays him fantastically, so it's a shame he was almost entirely cut from this movie. So Harry and the Weasleys arrive at the Burrow, and in the book, we're introduced to the two oldest Weasley brothers here, Bill and Charlie. Charlie was cut from the movies altogether, aside from Ron mentioning him a couple times, and in the picture of them in Egypt. And to be fair, I get why, as his role in the books is quite small. He does bring the dragons to Hogwarts for the second task of the Triwizard Tournament, but aside from that, we don't really see him all that much. Bill, on the other hand, is a pretty constant presence in the books after this point, and the movies didn't introduce him until Deathly Hallows Part 1, where it's just like, oh hey Harry, I'm Bill. The movies hadn't even mentioned him until then, so he just kinda comes out of nowhere. I do think Domhnall Gleeson was a good choice to play him. He's a good actor, and he certainly looks the part. Also, incidentally, he's the son of Brendan Gleeson, who plays Mad-Eye Moody. So I do wish they had introduced him here and had him in the movies more. One other Weasley who was completely cut from this movie is Percy. After his graduation from Hogwarts last year, Percy now works in the Ministry of Magic for the Department of International Magical Cooperation under Barty Crouch, who Percy greatly idolizes. We also learn during our time at the Burrow that Fred and George have been spending their time making joke items, including the Tongue toffee they tricked Dudley into eating, and plan to open a joke shop after they graduate, much to the disapproval of Mrs. Weasley, who wants them to work at the Ministry. Actually, come to think of it, Mrs. Weasley never appears in this movie either. I just realized that while writing this. So, finally catching back up to the movie, Mr. Weasley leads Ron, Fred, George, Ginny, Harry, and Hermione to the portkey that will take them to the Quidditch World Cup. Bill, Charlie, and Percy, being of age, will simply apparate later, and explains to Harry about portkeys, objects that can transport wizards to another location. They're generally objects muggles would overlook. In the movie, it seems like the kids have no idea where they're going, and that this is some big surprise Mr. Weasley is springing on them. On top of this just not being necessary, it just doesn't really make sense. If it was the entire family surprising Harry, that would make sense. But for Ron not to know that it was the day of the Quidditch World Cup final? Really? I do love this line, though.
Hey, Dad! Where are we going?
I'm the foggiest.
I don't know, maybe it's just because it reminds me of my dad. So they find the portkey and meet up with Amos Diggory and his son Cedric. We did technically meet Cedric in Prisoner of Azkaban, but this is the book where he actually has an important role. And non-readers probably don't even know it's the same person. I'm glad that Robert Pattinson has gone on to become known for more than just Twilight, because he honestly is a good actor, and I think he was a good choice for Cedric. Jeff Rawle also does a good job as Amos, however his character is written quite differently in the movie. He's very friendly and amiable all throughout, whereas in the book, while he is still those things, he's also very prideful and likes to boast about his son's accomplishments, sometimes to the point of being unintentionally rude. Like when he boasts loudly about Cedric beating Harry in a Quidditch match, right in front of Harry. He also comes across as judgmental at times and is quick to jump to conclusions about people. With all that said, he is ultimately a fairly minor character, so these changes don't really matter too much. Cedric's the more important character to the story, and if I'm being honest, I think this sequence does a decent job of establishing his character. We see his good nature and sense of sportsmanship in how he helps Harry to his feet, his popularity in how Hermione and Ginny look at each other, and his skill and competence in how he's the only one of the teens to not fall over after using the portkey. Basically telling us everything we learned about him in the Prisoner of Azkaban book in just a few shots. So the group arrives at the campground for the Quidditch World Cup, and I love Harry's reaction to the inside of the tent in the movie.
I love magic.
Something that's not really explained in the movie is that this is actually a Muggle campground, and Ministry wizards have to keep using memory charms on the camp's manager, Mr. Roberts, to make him forget things, as most of the wizards do not do a good job of dressing like Muggles or hiding their magic. We also see witches and wizards of other nationalities like Africans and Americans, as well as students from other wizarding schools like Beauxbatons. I really like all of this because it's cool world building, and I like seeing the ways wizards interact with muggles while also trying to keep their world secret. Unfortunately, the limitations of film do kind of demand it be cut. Harry, Ron, and Hermione also bump into some people they know in the book, like Seamus Finnegan, Dean Thomas, Ernie Macmillan, Cho Chang, and Oliver Wood. Also in the book, Mr. Weasley mentions the Department of Mysteries after seeing two people who work there. The Department of Mysteries will of course be a very important location in the next book, The Order of the Phoenix, and this is the first mention we get of it. The movie does also mention the Department of Mysteries at a later point, but, well, I'll get there. Now, the movie pretty much cuts instantly to the match after arriving at the campsite. In the book, however, we are first introduced to two characters who will be very important, or at least consistently present, throughout the book. Ludo Bagman and Barty Crouch. And I think I'll go off on a bit of a tangent here just to talk about these two. I'll get back to the plot afterwards. Let's start with Bagman. Ludo Bagman is a character who was cut from the movie altogether. And while I do enjoy his character, I don't blame the movie for not including him. He's a former Quidditch star and currently the head of the Department of Magical Games and Sports. In this capacity, he played a big part in organizing both the Quidditch World Cup and the Triwizard Tournament, and even acts as the announcer for both, as well as one of the 5 judges for the Triwizard Tournament, along with Crouch and the 3 headmasters. Throughout the book, Bagman is portrayed as a very jovial, friendly, fun-loving man who laughs at Fred and George's jokes and enthusiastically encourages the students. However, he doesn't seem to take his job that seriously, as he doesn't even try to act like a muggle around them, and doesn't even start organizing a search for Bertha Jorkins, who was one of his employees, until several months into her disappearance. We also see him offer Harry help with the Triwizard Tournament several times, even though he's supposed to be one of the unbiased judges, and we also learn that he once gave ministry information to Augustus Rookwood, who was a spy for Voldemort, though Bagman claims he didn't know this. These things make him another suspect, at least in our eyes, if not necessarily the characters, for who put Harry's name in the Goblet of Fire. Ultimately, however, Bagman proves to be innocent, and his information to Rookwood really was just a stupid mistake. As for why he was helping Harry, it turns out he has a big gambling problem and is seriously in debt to some goblins. So in order to pay that debt, he placed a bet on Harry to win the Triwizard Tournament. Unfortunately for him, since Harry tied for first place with Cedric, he technically lost the bet and goes on the run. So, yeah, a fun character, but since his main purpose is just to be yet another red herring, I think the filmmakers were ultimately right to cut him. Though his actions do result in the goblins not taking sides in the Second Wizarding War, as they're sick of being cheated by wizards. Now let's talk about Barty Crouch. Unlike Bagman, Crouch was too important a character to cut from the movie. That said, he is portrayed very differently in the movie than in the book. He's much more jovial, amiable, and honestly a little goofy in the movie. In other words, they gave him some of Ludo Bagman's personality traits. Barty Crouch in the book is very stiff and uptight, has next to no sense of humor, and is, quite frankly, rather unlikable. In addition, the movie cuts pretty much all of his backstory except the parts involving his son, and even those are portrayed quite differently. And I'll admit I am disappointed by this. I think Roger Lloyd-Pack did a very good job playing this part, especially the parts where he gets nervous and twitchy. You can tell his son's arrest did a number on him. Unfortunately, I think the character suffers in the way he was written for the movie. Barty Crouch is a very interesting character because while he only appears in one book, his role in the story has a very big effect, and his backstory is very important to the plot and themes of the series. About 3/4 of the way into the book, the trio and us are told about Crouch's backstory by Sirius. Crouch quickly rose through the ranks of the Ministry. Eventually, he became head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Crouch was very ambitious and power-hungry, not in the same way as Voldemort, who wanted to dominate everything, but just in the sense that he was willing to do anything to improve his standing and rank within the Ministry, and maybe even become Minister of Magic one day. He also hated the dark arts, so as head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, he led the fight against Voldemort during his first reign of terror. He was extremely ruthless in dealing with Voldemort's followers. He had people who were suspected of being Death Eaters arrested without a trial. In fact, it was Crouch who ordered Sirius's arrest. He authorized the use of torture via the Cruciatus Curse on prisoners for information, and he even gave Aurors permission to kill Death Eaters on sight. He essentially became the very thing he was fighting against. However, he was very effective, and the Ministry made more headway against Voldemort during his tenure as head of law enforcement than during any other time. As such, despite the cruelty of his acts, Crouch became very popular, and many people wanted him to become the next Minister of Magic. However, due to Crouch's obsession with his job, he ended up completely neglecting his son, who, lacking a real father figure in his life, sought out a new one. Barty Crouch Jr. is portrayed as a complete psychopath in the movie, and there's no real room for sympathy with him. However, in the book, while he certainly did turn out pretty sadistic, we can at least understand how he turned out that way, and that it ultimately goes back to a father who cared more about his job than his son. Shortly after Voldemort's downfall, Crouch Jr. was arrested alongside the Lestranges for torturing the Longbottoms, and this would be the start of Crouch Sr.'s fall from grace. The public initially demanded that those 4 Death Eaters be severely punished, so Crouch, in order to save his reputation, had his son sent to Azkaban. Unfortunately, people later started to wonder how Crouch Jr. had turned out the way he did, and concluded that it was because his father had never cared for him. So Crouch's reputation and popularity diminished, and he was pushed aside to the Department of International Magical Cooperation. Again, this is all stuff we don't learn until about 3/4 of the way into the book, but I felt like I should explain it now for the purposes of this video. Crouch in the movie comes across as a pretty decent man with an inexplicably psychotic son, and I feel like this portrayal severely diminishes the story. Crouch is a cautionary tale about going too far in the pursuit of justice and placing one's ambitions over one's family. He was completely obsessed with gaining power and fighting Voldemort and the Death Eaters, and it was precisely that obsession that not only led to his own fall from grace, but created one of the most dangerous Death Eaters of all, the one who would eventually enable Voldemort's return. So, back to the plot. The group meet Bagman and Crouch. The twins make a bet with Bagman on the outcome of the match. They bet that Ireland will win, but the Bulgarian seeker, Victor Krum, will catch the snitch. Bagman also comes close to telling them about an event that will take place at Hogwarts this year, that being the Triwizard Tournament, of course, but Crouch quickly stops him. On the way to the match, Harry buys himself, Ron, and Hermione each a pair of omnioculars, binoculars that have several special features like slowing things down and replaying things. The movie also glosses over pretty much everything that happens in the stadium. I don't blame the filmmakers for cutting the match itself, as it's ultimately unimportant. It's really the events that happen after and around the match that are important. Still, given the build-up, it does feel like a bit of an anticlimax to just skip right over it. Honestly, I feel like this was a bit of a no-win situation. Cutting the match makes it inevitably feel anticlimactic, but including it would have eaten up way too much screen time that needed to be devoted to more important things. This is where we get our first real look at Victor Krum, the Bulgarian seeker, who will become a more prominent character later in the book and movie. There are other things the movie cut and changed surrounding the match. First of all, in the movie, the Weasleys don't seem to be sharing a box with Cornelius Fudge. In the book, they do, because Ludo Bagman gave Mr. Weasley really good tickets after Mr. Weasley got his brother out of trouble with an enchanted lawnmower. The Malfoys are there as well, like in the movie, and this is actually the first glimpse we get of Narcissa in the book. There's also a really funny part involving the Bulgarian Minister of Magic who is sharing a box with them and can't seem to understand a word of English. Fudge struggles to translate things for him, but after the match, it turns out he actually does speak English and was just messing with Fudge. The most important thing here, though, is that we meet Winky, the house elf for the Crouch family. She and Harry talk a bit about Dobby, who Winky says wants payment for his work now that he's free, something house elves aren't supposed to ask for. She also says that she's saving the seemingly empty seat next to her for Mr. Crouch. However, as we learn at the end of the book, this is not the case. That empty seat is actually occupied by Barty Crouch Jr. under an invisibility cloak. You see, and this is all stuff we don't learn until the very end when Crouch Jr. confesses it, Crouch Sr., honoring the dying wish of his wife, actually smuggled his son out of Azkaban. His wife used Polyjuice Potion to switch places with her son, and she died soon afterwards, buried under the name of Barty Crouch Jr., as she still had his form. Crouch Sr. then used the Imperious Curse on his son to control and subdue him, and made him stay under the invisibility cloak at all times. Winky acted as his caretaker, and it was her who persuaded Crouch Sr. to let his son go to the Quidditch World Cup, given that he had loved Quidditch as a child, and his mother hadn't wanted to free him just so he would live another life of imprisonment. Ultimately, Crouch agreed. While I am disappointed that the movie removed the mystery surrounding Barty Crouch Jr., I don't really mind them cutting Winky. The book also shows us the mascots for each team. For the Bulgarians, it's a group of Vila, creatures resembling extremely beautiful women whose singing puts men in a sort of trance. Incidentally, Fleur Delacour is a quarter Vila. The Irish mascots are a bunch of leprechauns who fly together to form shapes and words, at one point even a hand raising its middle finger, and who drop gold coins on the audience. The match itself, which is commentated by Ludo Bagman, ends up pretty much exactly the way the Weasley twins predicted. Ireland gets ahead by 160 points, and Crom, wanting to end the match on his own terms, catches the snitch, despite the fact that this means his team ultimately loses the match. This means that Bagman has to pay the twins, as he lost their bet. This actually leads to another mystery that runs through the book, where the Weasley twins keep muttering about blackmailing someone, and we don't know who. In the end, we learn that they were talking about Bagman. It turns out he paid them with leprechaun gold he caught from the Irish mascots, and leprechaun gold vanishes after a few hours. So they were blackmailing him to make him give them the actual money he owed them. Since Bagman himself was cut from the movie, this mystery was as well, and I'm totally fine with that. After the match, I do love how the movie shows us Ron's admiration for Crom, which is particularly funny knowing how he does a complete 180 on him later. And now, of course, we come to the Death Eater attack, and I'll just say, the design of the Death Eater costumes in this movie I feel is a little too KKK-ish. Thankfully, they change it for the rest of the movies. This moment itself also kind of breezes by in the movie compared to the book, and when it's over, it cuts right to the Hogwarts Express. Like I said, it feels like the movie wanted to get to Hogwarts as quickly as possible. So we see the Death Eaters attacking, and something to note that the movie doesn't make entirely clear is that these Death Eaters are not acting on Voldemort's orders. These are the Death Eaters that talked their way out of going to Azkaban by denouncing him and claiming they had been bewitched to do his bidding. As far as they know, Voldemort is toast. They're just doing this for fun. And they're probably quite drunk as well. In the movie, Harry just kind of gets knocked out, but in the book, he, Ron, Hermione, the twins, and Ginny run into the woods as Mr. Weasley, Bill, Charlie, and Percy help fight the Death Eaters. While hiding in the forest, the trio gets separated from the twins and Ginny, and they encounter Malfoy, who seems to be rather enjoying watching the Death Eaters attack Muggles, leading them to suspect that his father is one of the people in masks. They're right, of course. They also encounter a group of students from Beauxbatons, some young wizards trying to impress a group of Vila, one of those wizards is actually Stan Shunpike, and Ludo Bagman, who seems uncharacteristically stressed, most likely due to the amount of money he lost betting on the match. They also see Winky running slowly and awkwardly away from where the Death Eaters are, which gets Hermione started on how unfairly house elves are treated. The reason Winky is moving so awkwardly, as we learn at the end, is because she's trying to fight against an invisible Barty Crouch Jr., who has snapped out of the Imperius curse his father placed on him and wants to attack the Death Eaters for their disloyalty to his master. So we come to the moment where the Dark Mark is conjured. Again, this is very different in both mediums. In the movie, Harry wakes, sees Barty Crouch Jr. conjure the mark, is rejoined by Ron and Hermione, and is then attacked by Barty Crouch Sr. and the other Ministry wizards. Also in the movie, Crouch Jr. only seems to conjure the mark after the violence is already over, whereas in the movie, it's the sight of the mark that scares away the Death Eaters. And as I mentioned before, whereas in the movie Crouch Jr. did this on Voldemort's orders, in the book he's still a prisoner of his father and is unable to rejoin Voldemort at the moment. He cast the mark to scare the disloyal Death Eaters. But getting back to what actually happens here in the book, unlike in the movie, we don't see who actually conjured the Dark Mark. It erupts from a dark patch of forest. After that, like in the movie, the trio are attacked by Ministry wizards led by Barty Crouch, who accuses them of conjuring the Dark Mark. In the movie, this is our first introduction to him. I love the way his eyes kind of pop out here and how his hand shakes as he points his wand at each of them. You really get a sense of this insane paranoia bordering on insanity that is most likely deep within him since his son's arrest. Now, in the movie, the conversation ends pretty quickly. Harry tells Crouch where he saw the man who conjured the mark, and then it cuts to the Hogwarts Express. In the book, there's a lot more that happens. When the trio tell them where the spell that conjured the mark came from, Amos Diggory, who is also present, goes to search the area. He finds an unconscious Winky. It turns out one of the stunning spells the wizards cast at the trio missed and hit her. Unbeknownst to them, one also hit Barty Crouch Jr., but Amos didn't find him since he was under an invisibility cloak. When Crouch sees the unconscious elf, he quickly rushes into the woods to search as well. As we learn at the end, this is because he realized his son was the one to conjure the mark, so he quickly found him and placed him back under the Imperius curse. After bringing her to, Amos accuses Winky, rather harshly, of conjuring the dark mark and reveals to the others that she had a wand with her when he found her. A wand that Harry recognizes as his. He had noticed it had gone missing earlier in the woods. We learn at the end of the book that Crouch Jr. had taken it from Harry's pocket in the stands. When Harry tells them it's his wand, Amos briefly shifts the blame over to him until Mr. Weasley points out to him how unlikely it is that Harry Potter conjured the dark mark. Amos starts accusing Winky again, who denies any knowledge of what happened. Crouch, in an attempt to save what's left of his reputation, fires Winky, much to her horror, claiming it's because she left the tent when he ordered her not to, but in reality it's because she allowed his son to acquire a wand and almost let him escape. Hermione gets really mad at Crouch about this, and this starts her on a crusade for elf rights throughout the series. Mr. Weasley brings the kids back to the tent, where he explains to them about the dark mark and how the Death Eaters used to cast it over houses where they'd killed. Bill then tells them that they managed to rescue the muggles the Death Eaters were torturing, and how they ran away when the dark mark appeared. So yeah, a lot of stuff happens here that the movie just glosses over, and it's a little difficult for me to gather my feelings on a lot of it. I really like all of this stuff in the book, and I wish it had been included in the film, but at the same time, I know there's only so much you can include in 2.5 hours. This is why I think Harry Potter would have been better as a TV series.